Good morning, and welcome to Redeemer Lutheran Church. I'm Pastor Gary Lodeholt. There's an important scene described in 1 Kings 18. The prophet Elijah presents himself for a discussion with Ahab, the king of Israel. When Ahab approaches the place where Elijah is and sees him, Ahab says, "Is it you, you troubler of Israel?" And Elijah responded, "I have not troubled Israel, but you have, because you have forsaken the Lord and followed the Baals." Elijah was right. Ahab was trouble indeed. This week we are looking at some of the lesser-known villains in the Bible and learning about their stories. Today we want to turn to Ahab, and truthfully, a lot of his problems come from his wife, who is more famously evil than Ahab himself. Her name was Jezebel. Perhaps you've heard the quote that behind every great man is a great woman. Well, in this case, you might say that behind the evil Ahab, there was an even more evil Jezebel. You see, Ahab and Jezebel were married as part of a treaty between Israel and the nation of Tyre. In those days, marriages were how treaties were cemented in place. So Jezebel was from Tyre, about where Lebanon is today, and when she came to Israel, she brought her Baals with her. In other words, she continued to devoutly worship false gods, and Ahab didn't stop her. Then she began to promote the worship of her gods all over Israel, and even convinced Ahab to build worship centers and shrines to Baal all over Israel everywhere. Well, you can bet this didn't go over well with Elijah, the prophet of God. First, Elijah told Ahab that if he didn't stop promoting worship of this false god, that it wouldn't rain until he did. Sure enough, it didn't rain for 3 years. This is when that famous scene takes place on top of Mount Carmel, where Elijah and the priests of Baal each built an altar and sacrificed a bull, and then called on their God to send down fire to consume the sacrifice. Nothing happened on Baal's altar. And of course, at God's altar, fire did come down, just as Elijah said. As far as the Bible views things, about the worst thing a person could do is to worship a false god. Yet that's what Ahab did. Then there is the story of Naboth's vineyard. Naboth was a man who had a vineyard that was doing very well. In fact, it was doing so well that King Ahab wanted it, even though he had his own vineyard right next door. But when he approached Naboth about buying the field, Naboth refused to sell because the land had been passed down in his family. At that time in Israel, they thought that such land had been granted to their family by God, and following God's will meant that you kept the land. Well, when he couldn't get it, King Ahab went to bed and pouted with his face to the wall. Jezebel said, "Get up. Aren't you the king? I'll take care of it." Jezebel arranged for Naboth to be falsely accused, and he was convicted and executed. Then she told Ahab to go and seize the field, and that's just what he did. He was happy and he had what he wanted. But Elijah knew what had happened, and publicly accused Ahab of murder and theft. To Ahab's credit, when Elijah confronted him about Naboth, Ahab sincerely repented. He knew how he was supposed to live following God, but he just seldom did it. In the end, Ahab was killed in a battle, being struck by an unaimed arrow. We are told that dogs came and licked up his blood. The Bible describes Ahab as more evil than all the kings before him. Ahab's story helps us to be on guard concerning the many forces that may seek to influence us away from God. In Ahab's case, that was Jezebel, but for us it can be a host of things that pull us away from God. Luther said, whatever your heart clings to and confides in, that is really your God. So it might behoove us to be troubled sometimes ourselves. Perhaps another learning we can grasp from this story is how we sometimes are so caught up by our wants that we fail to see what they mean for other people. Ahab wants Naboth's vineyard so much that he was willing to have Naboth destroyed in order to have it. We so often overinflate our own importance in having what we want. It's not about us. Finally, I might suggest that there is grace here too. For when Ahab repented for what had happened with Naboth, God forgave. Like Ahab, that's a grace we need. Thanks for watching, and remember to let this day belong to God.